Hi everyone, and welcome to Core Lecture 28. Today we'll discuss revising for argument development. Before we begin, you'll need the following materials for today's lecture assignment. You'll need access to your current project form materials, and you'll also need a document to write on. The purpose and goals for today's lecture are as follows. We'll determine the greater purpose of your argument, we'll examine argument placement in your text, and we'll situate evidence and supporting reasons appropriately. The first thing that we'll want to look at will be determining the argument's purpose. At this point in the semester, this should sound familiar. So understanding what your written content is about and what you ultimately want it to do. So this rings true just as much with Project 4, with our civic engagement argument. Now, when we are revising for content or argument development, the first thing that we want to nail down is, what do we want to do with our argument? Now, this should go beyond just mere persuasion of your thesis. So your thesis might be, to convince my audience that a later curfew for teenagers in the St. George area would be a welcome change. So of course, like that's, your overall thesis, but you want to paint it in broader terms to say, um, do you want people to think differently about a common or popular idea? Do you want to organize thought for change? Do you want to officially enact a policy or a law? So you want to be you want to be specific in what you want your overall thesis to do. So even if you are writing about extending the curfew for a certain demographic, older teenagers, let's say, are you doing it to say, hey, teenagers aren't all that bad if we give them the ability to go out, in the evenings past 9 p.m., they'll show that they're truly responsible. So do you want to challenge a popular idea? Do you want to organize for change? Maybe you find that the teenagers in the St. George area want to change their reputation and want to demonstrate that they are mature enough to have a later curfew. So are you trying um, to get them involved to be active in that changing of the reputation? Or do you want to officially enact a policy or law? So do you see your argument having a more direct application to your local area? So could you say, hey, based off of the evidence I've gathered, I think that this could have real applications in the community. So you do want to be aware of what that purpose is. So why are you making the argument that you're making? Again, is it to challenge a popular idea? Is it to say, hey folks, we've got an issue, we need to start organizing and start engaging in greater dialogue? Or is it saying, hey, I found a lot of interesting evidence that supports this argument I'm making, so I think this can be more immediately and directly applied to whatever community you want to apply it to. Now, once you have determined your argument's purpose, so again, why you're making that argument or suggesting that thesis in the first place, I would always suggest to write it down, or at least be very aware of it, as you should allow this purpose to guide your revision and evaluation. So everything that you include from then on out, once you've introduced your argument, should ultimately be going toward that argument's purpose. Because of course, even if your thesis is the same, you know, teenagers in St. George should have, a later curfew or should have an extended curfew. If you're doing it to challenge certain stereotypes or ideas, you'll probably incorporate different evidence than if you were trying to enact an official policy or law and a change in that. So once you know that purpose, you do want to keep it at the forefront of your revisions, because that's ultimately going to tell you, is this going to be appropriate to support my argument with the purpose I see it or would like to see it fulfill? Okay, so when we think about the place of our argument, now we got into this discussion in a prior core lecture when we talked about the different logics of argument, but this is how we can definitely see it playing out in the revision process. So remember that the argument should guide your piece. Your audience should be able to say, I understand how the content that the writer introduced from the reasons and the supporting evidence and the warrants that were developed, I can see how all of that goes to furthering the persuasive quality of the overall argument. So remember that your argument, regardless of where it is, should guide your piece. Now, you want to think critically about how you want your reader to arrive at your argument. Typically in Western academic standards, so what you would do in a North American or Western European university, is typically you would, your argument would open your piece. So it would be in the first paragraph or two. And this is going to be, again, fairly standard in the American university, especially where the thesis is right there in the first opening section of your text. You make your reader very aware of whatever that thesis is. And again, you tie back to that as you go throughout your text. But as we've also discussed, there are ways in which you can put your thesis toward the end and have your reader arrive at that conclusion on their own. As I mentioned, not as commonly practiced. This is not a commonly practiced organizational method in the American university. So you just do want to be a bit wary of it, or you want to be aware that you're using that structure and that your organization is still clear to your reader, because it does kind of stray from what is typically practiced, but it is always certainly an option. So, when you think about what your overall argument is, what its purpose is, you want to think about where you want to place it. So, are you going to put it in the first few paragraphs and allow that to explicitly guide your text throughout the rest of your essay? Or do you, again, want to hint at it and have the reader sort of arrive at that conclusion, your argument, toward the end of your piece? Whichever one you select is ultimately going to influence how you frame your evidence and how you can help your reader make sense of the evidence that you're introducing. Now, when we think about situating the evidence, first and foremost, we want to determine what role the evidence plays in our writing. So is it meant to, the first way we can look at it will be logos, pathos, and ethos. We're always going to keep revisiting Aristotle in this course. So is it, do you introduce certain pieces of evidence to, um, fulfill and speak to the logos of your argument? Are you doing it to invoke an emotional response? Are you doing it to establish authority in your piece and credibility in your overall argument? So you want to think about what roles what role does each specific piece of evidence play in your piece? Because again, the way that you see this evidence fitting in to support your overall argument is ultimately going to influence how you frame it and the type of language that's peppered around it. So if you're really doing it to emphasize the ethos of your argument, then perhaps you dedicate more text to talking about how the author is authoritative. But if you are doing it to prompt an emotional response, maybe you're focusing in and introducing more words that have emotional qualities to them. So again, that's the way that you see your evidence working in your overall argument can, and I think should, change the way that you approach it and you frame it for readers. So, when we think about the ways in which your audience will navigate the evidence, so you want to think critically about the amount of agency your audience will have. Now, when we think about traditional academic writing, you're fairly locked in, because when we think of agency, we think of, okay, well, how much control does the reader have to go from one idea to the next? Now, because academic pieces are more linear in structure, we go to page 1, then to page 2, then to page 3, and that type of order um, is expected. They don't have a lot of agency. But think if you were writing this piece for, let's say, like a website, or you were using another digital platform like a social media page or something along those lines. That is an instance in which you can see your readers having greater agency and how they're going to control and navigate how they arrive to certain pieces of evidence. But again, with academic writing, you're locked in pretty strongly to that linear structure of, first I'm going to talk about this, then that, and then so on and so forth. And there's a more clear sequence where you can actually employ some of the transition words that we've discussed over the course of the semester. You also want to think about how your audience is going to engage with each form of evidence. So, are they going to be expected to understand it as an appeal to logos? So, are they going to need to understand it clearly as an appeal to ethos? So, of course, you want to be sure that you've clearly defined that. And like I said, this can and should influence the language used to guide your reader from one point to the next. So, going back to those discussions that we had with transitions, and if you haven't watched the mini lecture yet on composing clear and effective transitions, this might be an opportunity to do that. So you want to think, okay, how do I see this evidence not only fitting in the overall argument that I'm making, but how do I see it fitting in with some of the other forms of evidence that I'm introducing? What kind of transition words should I use to guide readers from one point to the next? Should I emphasize the more logical qualities? Again, if I'm appealing to logos, should I emphasize and use language to emphasize the more logical components of the piece that I think are relevant to my argument? Should I use language to emphasize the appeal to anger that I want my audience to experience as a reaction to this evidence? So always keep that in mind. We also can keep an eye out for these methods for assessing development. Of course, first and foremost, you clearly determine what you want your argument to do. So it goes beyond just saying, oh, I want to persuade them to open up a new store in the mall. Okay, well, do you want it to, again, challenge ideas? Do you see it being a more ready way to enact a certain policy in your area or a certain law? You also want to think critically about the audience you want to engage. So for this piece, it's more of an academic audience. And so you want to, of course, think about how you can appeal to that certain type of audience. You also want to understand the affordances of your platform or genre. Again, with academic writing, it's going to be more print-based, so it's going to be from one page to another, page 1, page 2. But as you continue to advance throughout your academic and professional career, chances are strong you'll have the opportunity to use other platforms for composing. So you'll want to be aware of that in future courses to say, hey, I have the opportunity to put together this infographic or make a video or create a website. So what does that platform or that genre allow you to do and emphasize in ways that perhaps traditional academic writing doesn't? You'll also review all included forms of evidence and support. And the thing that I think is most critical in any revision consideration regarding writing is that all choices must be read as intentional. So if you are playing around, with a new idea, or you are wanting your audience to feel a certain type of emotion or perceive evidence in a certain way or read your argument through a specific lens, that all has to be intentional and that all has to be clear to your reader. So, whatever choice you decide to make, be it your organization, the evidence that you include, the reasons that you provide, the warrants that you develop, everything to your audience must basically prompt them to say, oh, I understand why the writer included this. I understand how it's relevant. And I see how they thought that this would enhance or improve the argument that they're making. So I think that's the biggest revision suggestion I can make for this semester overall, is just make sure that all of your choices are intentional, they read as intentional, and your audience walks away saying, oh yeah, I see why they did that. Because when your audience has that kind of reaction, you know that you have produced an effective piece of writing. As we round out this discussion, there are some questions that we can ask ourselves that perhaps will more readily let us evaluate the development of our argument. So, the first question that we want to ask ourselves is, will the audience be able to locate my argument? This is especially important if you are sort of flipping the script, if it were, to say, hey, maybe I want to put my key argument at, in the conclusion. Maybe I want my audience to arrive at the argument on their own. Okay, well, if that's the case, if you are sort of breaking from the norm, and experimenting with different ways of content development and organization, will your audience be able to competently locate your argument? Would you be able to approach one of your readers and say, locate my argument, and they would be able to do that regardless of where it fell in the text? What is the purpose of my argument? We addressed that toward the beginning. Does the included evidence and reasons speak to both the argument itself and its purpose? So, if you're wanting to challenge certain stereotypes or ideas, does your argument do that? Versus if you're trying to propose a new law or a new policy. So again, something a bit more readily and immediately applicable to your community. And of course, how do you want your readers to experience and engage with your argument? Um, so with that, this is really going to depend on who your audience is. So maybe you find yourself saying, I want my audience to engage with this argument in a more logical manner. So if that's the case, you want to make sure that your organization is logical. You want to make sure that the evidence that you incorporate speaks more to logos. Versus if you say, hey, I really want to, given the topic, the argument that I'm trying to make, I really want this to resonate with people on an emotional level. Okay, well, if you want them to engage with your argument in a more emotional sense, are you setting your argument up in a way that facilitates that reaction for your audience? So as you go through, make sure you're asking yourself these questions. So the first one, will the audience be able to locate my argument? So if at any point you find yourself saying, well, yeah, I think. So if you say anything less than yes, absolutely, you want to revisit your text and say, how can I make sure that my argument is explicitly stated, is clear, clearly written, and easy to identify? So anything less than yes, absolutely, warrants a revisit uh, to your draft. If you can't define the purpose of your argument, do some free writing. Really think about what you want your argument to do. So if your audience says, yes, I believe you, and yes, I accept your argument as truth, cool. So what's the next step after that? Does the included evidence and reasons speak to both the argument itself and its purpose? Again, anything less than yes, absolutely, will prompt you to return to your draft and say, okay, where are the areas that I'm perhaps not as confident on, and why am I not confident? And then how can I best address this issue or this shortcoming I've noticed in my writing? And then, of course, how do I want my reader to experience, engage with my argument? So again, if this is something much like the second question, if you can articulate it or give what I would call an elevator speech, so briefly explain to someone, briefly and clearly explain to someone how you want your readers to react, this would be a good opportunity to do some free writing. So that way you can ensure that you know what you want your audience to take away from your argument, as well as how you want them to understand and engage with that content. And that way you can better say, does my draft do that? Does my draft accomplish that goal? So for the lecture assignment, here's what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to review your current project for materials, including any and all feedback you've received either from myself or your peers. And then based off the content we've discussed during this lecture, as well as the feedback that you've received, I want you to compose a brief reflection, so about 50-ish words, identifying a specific section in your draft that you would like to improve with strategies discussed during today's lecture. So do you have, perhaps you find yourself saying, well, I want to work on the introduction so I can make sure that my argument is clear and that it is easily identifiable by my audience. Maybe you say, hey, I really want to look at the third reason that I provide. I don't know if perhaps it aligns with the purpose that I have for the argument overall, and maybe I want to rework that. So those are just a couple of examples that you can draw from as you're reviewing your current project for draft and materials. Okay, so that is it for this lecture. For your weekly homework, you'll want to include your core lecture 28 summary and assignment in your week 15 homework submission. Overall, though, your week 15 homework submission should include the summaries and lecture assignments for core lectures 28 and 29, as well as the summary and lecture assignment of a mini lecture of your choice. That is all going to be due to Canvas by Sunday, April 21st. If you have any questions or would like to discuss any of these concepts in greater detail, please don't hesitate to contact me via Canvas DM. All right, everyone, until next time.